Warning! If you have a fear of tentacles coming out of the water and pulling you down into the abyss, you may find this video to be highly disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to Back-to-Back Horror Stories, where we tell you two different strange and/or creepy stories back-to-back.
Today's stories include some of the most strange and disturbing deep-sea mysteries of all time. If you haven't already, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Alright, now onto the video.
On March 25, 1941, the S.S Britannia, a British ocean liner, was en route from Liverpool to Bombay when it suddenly came under attack by a German merchant vessel known as Thor. Despite putting up a stiff resistance for a little over an hour, the crew of the Britannia found themselves hopelessly outmatched, and they were forced to send out distress signals and abandon ship. A ship which was now filled with hundreds of dying men, women, and children. And to make matters even worse, the few remaining survivors were given only 5 minutes by the German enemy to escape on lifeboats in an effort to hopefully save their own lives. Despite this, most of the lifeboats were hit by shell fire anyway, and ultimately sank along with the SS Britannia itself. By this point, some of the only remaining survivors out of nearly 300 people were 12 men all crowded on a single lifeboat no larger than a medium-sized rug, as the Germans refused to allow anyone to seek refuge on their merchant vessel. And thus began the beginning of 5 days of pure hell, even worse than any of them could possibly imagine. For starters, because the life raft that they were on could only hold so many people, they found themselves forced to take turns hanging onto the side of it while submerged in the water. One of the group, a man by the name of R.E.G. Cox, who would later provide a detailed account of his story to writer Frank W. Lane, was floating in the water near the boat when he was stung in the legs, hand, mouth, and head by a poisonous jellyfish known as a Portuguese man-of-war, causing him a tremendous amount of pain. And as the days went by, the harsh conditions of the crowded lifeboat, combined with the blazing hot sun and lack of food and water, caused several of the men to begin to go insane. The first of these was a formerly respected naval officer whose body they were forced to throw overboard, leading to an extremely disturbing unintended consequence. And that's because when they woke up the next morning, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by hundreds of sharks whose fins were now circling them from every angle. Soon after, more and more of the men in the raft began to go insane, causing the boat to actually overturn on several different occasions, and according to Lieutenant Cox, even he himself became victim of a brutal physical assault by one of the other crew members. By the 5th day, only 4 out of the original 12 were still alive, but even this small group remaining would not go untouched, or untentacled. The next victim to die was an Indian servant who first had his legs bitten off by a shark, and as if that wasn't bad enough, then became victim of something far worse, when several long tentacles suddenly emerged from the waters below, seized hold of his body, and pulled him down into the abyss. Following this horrifying episode, the now 3 men remaining agreed to a death pact for later that night, but before that could even happen, tentacles once again came out of the water, wrapped around Lieutenant Cox's entire body with a particular focus on his right leg, and tried pulling him down under just as they had done to the Indian servant before. But luckily for Lieutenant Cox, this time his quick-thinking comrades were within reach to batter the tentacles enough to get the creature to release him from its malicious grip, effectively saving him from being eaten alive, and with the only trace left being a series of sucker-shaped scars all across his body. In the end, these 3 remaining survivors of the SS Britannia were finally rescued at the last minute by a Spanish ocean liner near the island of Tenerife. Several years later, when Lieutenant Cox told his story to writer Frank W. Lane, he and others brought in a specialist by the name of John Cloudesley Thompson to examine Cox's scars at Birkbeck College, and even he came to a shocking conclusion. That is, that the marks left on Cox's body, of which were around 1 1/4 inches in size, had to belong to a squid over 23 feet in length.
In 1940, 1947, or 1948, it really depends on which newspaper or news article you look at, a very disturbing SOS call was made from a Dutch freighter named the S.S Ourang Medan. It made this distress call while it was passing through the Strait of Malacca, and it was heard by many different ships in many different locations. The message goes as followed, but when it was sent in Morse code. We float, all officers including captain dead, lying in chart room and on bridge, probably whole crew dead. I die. After this message was sent out, it was heard between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. A ton of American, English, and Dutch ships were on the end of that call. The American ship, the Silver Star, had tried to reach back out to the Ourang Medan many times, all to no avail. Due to all the stations and ships that heard this distress call, they were able to pinpoint the exact location of the Ourang Medan. So the Silver Star takes the opportunity to go investigate and figure out what happened. After getting the coordinates and taking the trip, the Silver Star had finally reached the location of the Ourang Medan, and the Dutch freighter was completely still. The engines were not running, there were no signs of the men, nothing. This is never a good sign. And as soon as the crew members of the Silver Star had saw this and realized what was going on, they tried to make contact with the Ourang Medan yet again. Nobody answered their Morse code signals, and so the crew on the Silver Star decided to form a search party and go onto the ship and see what was going on. The search party boarded the ship, and what they saw would haunt them all forever. The crew members were on the decks, and they were all dead, and their faces were contorted as if they had just died mid-scream. They were all suffering from an immense amount of decay, like they had died weeks ago, but the distress call just came in earlier that day. The captain was found on his bridge, and the rest of the bridge officers were found in the wheelhouse and chart room. In the wireless room, which is a room where all the radio equipment is installed, was a young operator lying on the ground. They assumed that he was the one who sent the distress call, and he still had his headphones on and his hand on his key. The engineering crew were all found in similar contorted positions at their designated stations as well. Even the dog that was on the ship had died mid-growl. So whatever happened to these men must have been absolutely terrifying. All in all, 22 total crew members were found dead, and one lifeboat was missing, but apparently was never found. The search party went back to their boat and decided to come up with a plan with the rest of the crew. The Silver Star crew decided to tow the ship to the nearest port, and they got ready to do just that. So they roped it up, and while they were in the middle of that, an insane amount of smoke started coming from the Ourang Medan's cargo hold. The Silver Star crew decided to cut the ship loose, and within seconds, the Ourang Medan exploded, it went airborne, and then it went back into the water and sank, leaving nothing behind. There's a bit of speculation with this story and whether or not it's real because of some of the circumstances behind everything, but we're gonna go over all of that. Like I said earlier, this story could have happened in 1939, 1940, 1947, 1948. It's not really specified because there's so many different articles written about it. The earliest official mention of this was in May of 1952 by the United States Coast Guard in a book titled Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council. It's pretty hard to dispute something that was written by the United States Coast Guard, as what would be their reason to lie? There were also a ton of newspaper articles written from 1939 to the 1960s about when and what happened to the ship, so to pinpoint an exact date is almost impossible. According to one story, the lifeboat that was missing actually washed ashore of the island of Tongi, which is a part of the Marshall Islands. There were 7 total passengers, and 6 of them had died, while one of them was still alive but hanging on for dear life. A missionary on the island helped take care of him, and his name was apparently Jerry Rabbit. He said that the Ourang Medan arrived in Ballast, Shanghai on June 7th of 1947, and that's where he was recruited. According to Jerry, none of the commanders on the ship asked him for any of his papers, and that was said to be most likely the case with all of the other crew members as well. He said while in Shanghai, they took off 7,000 boxes of unknown material, and then they sailed south to a small harbor. At the small harbor, around 8,000 boxes were then loaded onto the ship, and then they set sail for the coast of Costa Rica. Jerry said while the ship was sailing, they were purposefully avoiding common shipping routes. After about 10 days on board, everyone started to fall ill. This started with the stokers, and one of them had immediately died. And so the captain said, well, it was probably just because of a heat stroke. A lot of the crew members on board were not buying that because they just thought that where the stokers were, they just would not have a heat stroke. So they were all very skeptical. Days started passing and everyone started to get sick. They had severe stomach pains and severe cramping. It was bad. Jerry started looking through some papers on the ship, and he found out that they were carrying 15,000 loaded boxes full of sulfuric acid and cyanide, and also 20 canisters of nitroglycerin. He thought that some of them had probably started to leak and that everyone was being exposed to the fumes, and he tried to tell the captain. The captain was apparently stubborn and refused to make any emergency calls, and so Jerry and 6 other crew members took a lifeboat and they got out of there. The problem was that they didn't bring any extra food or water So 6 out of the 7 men ended up dying before they even reached the shore, and within days, Jerry died of exhaustion. But the biggest problem here is that there's no factual evidence that the Ourang Medan ever actually existed. Researchers have looked into pretty much all documentation that you can look into, and there's nothing about the Ourang Medan anywhere. And also, there's no actual pictures of the ship. It's just made up pictures, just interpretations and what they believe the ship actually looked like. Also, the Silver Star apparently never existed as well, but it did. It was originally named the Santa Cecilia by the Grace Line, which was a prominent shipping business in Peru. And then the United States Maritime Commission drafted it in 1946 and renamed it the Silver Star. But then, sometime in 1947, it was reacquired by the Grace Line and they renamed it the Santa Juana. The ship was then scrapped about 30 years later in 1971. So it did exist, but it was only the Silver Star for a short period of time. And that is where we're going to end our story of the Ourang Medan. What are your thoughts about this? Do you think it was some kind of gas leak or some kind of alien abduction?
All right, guys, that's going to do it for us today.
If you want to follow us on either Instagram or TikTok to watch our short form content, the link is in the bio. Forgot to say thanks for watching.
Can I say it now?
Yeah.
Thank you for watching.